text. We're joined here in Copenhagen at the Bella Center by two people. Martin Kors is Executive Director of the South Center, a journalist. Also, Naomi Klein, author of The Shock Doctrine. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! You've been watching this carefully. We're going to go back to the Sudanese delegate responding to this so-called secret Danish text. Martin Kors, explain further.
I think we all have been told that there is no plan B for Copenhagen and that we have to work very hard, on the documents on the table. So the fact that we have this 10-page document shows that they have been working on a plan B. And most of the developing countries that I have spoken to do not know at all about this text. So they feel shortchanged in that they had no say, they were not invited to contribute to a text that may be parachuted down on them later on this week by the ministers or by the presidents, and they would not have had enough time to look at it. So the process is what is bothering many, but also the substance, because the text calls for a 50% cut in global emissions by 2050, and it says that the developed countries are willing to cut by 80%. So my calculations show that if this is being proposed, the developing countries would have to cut their emissions by at least 60% per capita, or about the same as the developed countries, and that will bring their per capita emissions of greenhouse gases to about 2 tons per person by 2050, whereas a country like the United States, which now has 20 tons per capita, would go down to about 4 tons. So this means that the U.S. would still be able to have double the per capita emissions that poor developing countries have in 2050, when the United States is so superior in terms of income, in technology, and they have contributed so much, to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is what is outraging the developing countries.
And Martin, what do you think developing countries are going to do? Do you suspect that there'll be a walkout? What is the next step?
I don't think there will be a walkout, but they would now, I think, in fact, they should now come out with their own text, to say that this is our position on what we see as the Copenhagen decision, and not something that somebody else is putting for us. I think the other major issue for the developing countries is that this text implies the closure of the Kyoto Protocol. And that's something that all the developing countries are united against, because the Kyoto Protocol is the legally binding international agreement. The only country not in it is the United States.
Naomi Klein, let's go on from what Martin Kors is saying. The issue of the Kyoto Protocol in the United States is always talking about it sunsets, it ends in 2012. But that's not true.
It's one of the great misconceptions, and I actually didn't fully understand it until Martin explained it to me, so he probably can explain it much better than I can, but there is no expiration date on the Kyoto Protocol. What it had was a first period of emissions cuts that ends in 2012, and the idea was that countries would come back together and increase their emission cuts and develop the agreement. But the idea that it just needs to be scrapped completely and replaced with a wholly new deal, and that in addition to this there isn't time to come up with a whole new deal, which is the position of the U.S. negotiators here, is based on this faulty premise that the Kyoto Protocol expires. But I think the real issue here is what they want to replace the Kyoto Protocol with is much weaker than the Kyoto Protocol. They want to the Kyoto Protocol comes up with a goal for all the countries that they have to reach in terms of emissions cuts, and it's legally binding. Here, what they want to replace it to is all countries go off, come up with their own goals, and then it's sort of mashed together into an agreement that really isn't a multilateral agreement, because the whole idea of multilateralism is that countries agree on the same set of rules, and they agree to a common monitoring mechanism. So the great irony of what's happening here in Copenhagen is that it takes place in this context of this huge global celebration of the U.S. re-embrace of multilateralism. in fact, Obama is getting the Nobel Prize specifically for this. In the citation for the Nobel Prize, they talk about the re-engagement with the climate talks, the embrace of multilateralism. He's getting the Nobel Prize for it, but what's actually happening here is that they're using the tools of multilateralism, the infrastructure of multilateralism, to destroy multilateralism, to kill multilateralism.
We're going to break, then we're going to come back to this discussion. Naomi Klein, well-known journalist, author of The Shock Doctrine, and the 10th anniversary edition is just out of her first book, No Logo. Martin Kohr with us, Executive Director of the South Center. We're live in Copenhagen. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with them. Then we'll be joined by the chief climate change negotiators from 2 Latin American countries, from Paraguay and Bolivia. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. It is Climate Countdown. We're live in Copenhagen at the Bella Center, the only global daily news hour, broadcasting on television, radio, and the Internet from right here at the Climate Talks at COP15, the Conference of Parties. Our 2 guests right now are Naomi Klein. She's blogging for The Nation magazine, and she is author of The Shock Doctrine and No Logo. Martin Kohr is with us as well. He's Executive Director of the South Center. He's based in Geneva, comes from Malaysia. And then we'll be joined by the chief climate negotiators from 2 Latin American countries, from Paraguay and Bolivia. I'm Amy Goodman with Anjali Kamat. Anjali?
Martin, can you talk about some of the numbers in the Danish text, the text produced by the Circle of Commitment? They talk about $10 billion to be invested in this.
$10 billion for developing countries to take all these actions to prevent climate change and to tackle the effects of climate change is too minuscule. You know, the United Nations recently...
That's $10 billion a year? $10
billion a year. But the UN estimated that we require at least $500 to $600 billion a year, and a new study in London shows that you need at least $500 billion a year. In fact, in my estimation, we need at least 2% of the GNP of the rich countries, and that's about $800 billion a year.
What does it pay for?
You see, you have to allow the developing countries to continue their economic growth and at the same time to reduce their emissions. The only way in which they can do this is if we have massive transfers of finance and technology, you know, not for luxuries, but simply to get food production and housing and, you know, to build the seawalls and so on. If this amount of money does not come, then the developing countries are sunk or frightened by climate change. And they won't be able to take their own actions in terms of changing their technology in transportation, in energy, in industry, and so on.
I think one of the things that's so important about this is that we all have a vested interest in this. It's not, first of all, it's not charity. It is based on the principle that the polluter pays, that the rich world created the climate crisis. So it isn't a handout. But in addition to it not being a handout, as Martin says, everybody in the world has an interest in helping the developing world to leapfrog over fossil fuels and develop using cleaner but more expensive technologies, more expensive upfront, because the technologies are expensive at the start. Eventually, they actually become cheaper than fossil fuels, but there is a heavy upfront cost, and that's what these numbers would be covering in part.
And can you talk a little bit about the issues around the transfer of technology and how it ties into trade agreements and intellectual property rights?
Well, the thing is that technology will be required if we are to change from, the old patterns of energy in developing